After you head to the November participation, go ahead and click on Resubmit. And in the text box, type at least three significant things from today's lesson. So, public sector economics. This is talking about government involvement in the economy. And economists point to 8 different things that could result in what we know as market failure and the necessity for some type of government involvement. Of course, the debate about is when exactly and the point of any of these 8 they should get involved and how. But these are often identified as reasons behind government involvement. And the first one we mentioned in the bell ringer, and that would be negative externalities. So, negative side effects that occur, like pollution, for instance. That's one of the biggest ones that's concentrated on now. And that's because obviously economic productivity and the waste that it produces in the form of pollution has different impacts on us that we don't necessarily understand, but will as time goes by. So the government often responds to negative externalities either with regulation banning certain activities, but that's obviously difficult when it comes to activities that are necessary for economic productivity. And so that might also result in some form of taxation. So, for instance, Pigovian taxes are meant to tax a certain type of activity to decrease its occurrence. They can also be creative and come up with things like what's commonly known as cap and trade, giving companies credits for decreasing pollution, and those that are able to decrease it exceptionally well can sell off the surplus of their credits to a company who hasn't decreased their pollution, so that way they both meet whatever threshold the government sets aside. And that creates kind of a private sector activity in order to decrease the negative externality. Then there are positive externalities. So there are positive side effects. And one might wonder, why would the government need to get involved? Why is there a market failure if there's a positive externality? Well, perhaps because the positive externality isn't as enjoyed by as much of the population as possible. For instance, education has a positive side effect. The more learned we become, the more productive we are, the more capable employees we are, the better business owners we can become. And so that obviously helps out everyone else in the meantime, not just ourselves. And so the government often tries to increase the supply of these positive externalities. And that's why, for instance, a public education system is provided. So whenever someone says, why am I still paying property taxes? I got my education 30 years ago. Well, you're not really paying for yours. You're paying for everyone. You pay to live in an educated society, which is good for everybody. So it's trying to increase the positive externality of education. Another one would be lack of information. In many Adam Smith's theories, or you watch that little video of Ayn Rand, for instance, and they talk about the individual self-interest and that we should be rational. But the problem is in order to be rational, you have to have information, and we don't always have information. Companies wish to protect secrets, especially if it's some kind of new and innovative way of providing a good or service. But often that protection turns into a situation where people don't know all the risks involved in a good or service. And so the government establishes product standards that allows for better information to be distributed. Sometimes, of course, it's in pages and pages of fine print for things like insurance, for instance. But in other cases, it's for information that's produced directly on the product. For instance, ingredients in food and the calorie count, stuff like that. So that is meant to stop any type of negative externality from happening or for market failure to occur. Then there are monopolies. And this is one that you've already talked about in previous social studies classes, but monopolies are, of course, an antithesis of the free market system because it eliminates competition. And whenever there is a lack of competition, it means that there isn't as much innovation. The product isn't being provided at its lowest price possible. And so the government in turn creates antitrust laws to break up monopolies whenever they stifle competition like that. That's, of course, going back to the Sherman Antitrust Act, the first of those in the United States. Then there are things called merit goods. These are goods that have ripple effects that further standard of living and economic development because of their existence. One of the examples of this would be pensions. Pensions, of course, help us as individuals remain with a certain standard of living as we become older and unable to work. But they also further economic advancement because we are continuing to be consumers. We're continuing to spend, which then, of course, buys products, which then those products have to be made by somebody else, and so on. The problem is that pensions don't provide an immediate satisfaction, and so people don't always necessarily engage in them. And pension companies obviously want to guarantee that input is being made. And so they, of course, want some, even if you go and invest in a stockbroker, for instance, or something like that off to begin with, they want at least a minimum amount put aside. And so that creates some barriers to entry for people enjoying this good that would be beneficial for everybody. And so that's why the government provides an increase in supply for this one as well. In some countries, they make laws mandating certain amounts of contribution to some type of pension, or there's some type of subsidized program provided, for instance, like Social Security, which is all it's meant to be. It's meant to subsidize people at the end of their lives. It's not really meant to be their main source of income. And then there's non-merit goods, goods that end up through their ripple effects causing more harm to society than they do good. And that would include things like alcohol and tobacco. Environmentalists would argue gasoline. And so often the government uses regulation and taxes to curb both supply and demand of these particular activities. And even though it does decrease those, it doesn't really a lot, because often these products are what we call inelastic goods, which means that their demand and supply really don't react that much to the price increases due to taxes. So even though it does decrease, for instance, the demand on cigarettes a little bit, maybe a few tens of thousands of people will stop smoking if the price of a pack of cigarettes goes up. But in the totality of the number of people, that really isn't that big. And so you're still going to have a lot of people smoking. So some people argue that really it's just a way for the government to make increased revenue. And then there are public goods. Public goods have two characteristics. They're non-excludable and they're non-rivalrous. In other words, no one can be excluded or said no to enjoying this product, and one person enjoying it does not diminish another person's ability from enjoying it. The problem is, of course, is often there's not a profit for this type of activity, or at least not a good profit. And for ethical reasons, maybe it's good that companies don't enjoy a profit from this anyway. Probably the best example would be national defense. The United States Army, Navy, Marines, Coast Guard, Air Force, Space Command, Space Force, whatever it's called. All these things benefit all of us, and me consuming it doesn't stop you from consuming it. And so it's non-rivalrous, and all of us get to enjoy it, so it's non-excludable. And if we think about it, really, what would a for-profit military look like? Well, mostly that's mercenary, and that's untrustworthy, and they would have to give a pretty big price ticket to the entire country in order to provide that. And then the last one that I'll give to you is actually a couple different ones coupled together, but these are probably the most controversial, and that would be factor immobility and inequality. Factor immobility basically means that because of your geographic location, there is some type of market failure that occurs. And the reason why this one's controversial is because most people would say, well, move, if that's the problem. So they really don't have a lot of sympathy for the most part, especially the more free market oriented economists because they say, well, then why you should live there. Ayn Rand, for instance, would say when people complain about rural areas, there's not good enough roads or high-speed internet, she would say, well, why are you living there then? Move, sell your home to nobody, because she's telling everybody to leave. But she would say that that's a choice to live there. But the government does provide, of course, resources, roads, schools, bridges, sometimes government support of hospitals. That's not all the time, though. And it is becoming more and more involved in trying to provide high-speed internet. Of course, that is subsidized heavily through taxation, and most of those taxes come from suburbs and cities. Inequality is the other one I would include in this, because most of it is looked at as a lack of distribution of resources. For instance, if a country's GDP is high, but most of the people are, for instance, lower income or maybe even living in poverty, is that an effective use of the gross domestic product? So some would argue from a normative standpoint, the way the world should be, that there should be some kind of distribution of goods. Of course, those are people looking at more of a socialist type of outcome. That's why that one is controversial as well.